So I have a solution for the credibility crisis in science. You might have heard about it. It's not necessarily like a crisis anymore, but it's sort of this idea that a lot of scientific findings are hard to replicate. And, you know, we've sort of come a long way since this was revealed in the 2010s. And we've come a long way to sort of say that it's actually a hard problem. But here is what I propose. You want to change the credibility crisis or the credibility problem. You need to pay people. Honestly, you need to figure out a better way to compensate individuals. And a lot of what happens in science is actually driven just simply by the incentives that are there. And I want to talk about that. It's not necessarily like the tenure process and all of that kind of stuff. That's not what it is. It's the competition. The publish or perish idea in academia. And it's not driven by, it's part of it is driven by the tenure process, but another part of it is the norms of I'm better than you, ultimately. And if you want to change how science is actually done, one way is to sort of stress things like social norms and to train people better and all of those kind of things. But ultimately, I view this as an incentive problem where there is a lot of political action that happens behind the scenes where you have outcomes that are not necessarily, favorable. So, to give me an example, right? A simple example would be you're testing the relationship between A and B. Very simple relationship. Well, if you gather some data and you spend a day gathering data and you test that relationship between A and B, whatever that, with whatever data that you're thinking of, and if you just you find a confirming relationship, then you stop. And then you say, that's good enough, right? And so the reason why people do that is because of the incentives that are in play for people to, publish more. So look at that relationship and they'll just write it up and send it out and try to publish it. That's honestly what happens a lot. And then the other thing that ends up happening is that there's a lot of action that would require to get around a lot of these issues like data transparency, the sharing of data, people working together, a lot of those kind of things, right? Where it involves people to work together to sort of reveal things and to be better scientists. They're not going to do it if it's going to cost them time and energy, because ultimately we're in a competitive game. Science is a competition. It is not a cooperative thing that people sort of talk about. And the reason is that there's only so many resources that go around, and you compete for those resources. So whether it's being, resources, funding, for example, financial funding is what everybody thinks about, but it's often like really implicit things, right? Like time or, working with graduate students, all of those things are really important. Or somebody volunteering to teach an extra course, for example, or, to take load off of something, or, shifting things around. Often it's those very small things that they ultimately add up and they end up being very costly and very expensive because people are pursuing those things. And if we're going to change the credibility crisis, and so it's never a problem, it's never going to be, a punitive thing you're not going to be able to sort of change it by validating. There's sort of two sides of the coin. Is that you can either teach people how to do something, right? That's one side. Or you can sort of penalize them. That's another side. And that's the sort of setup that's set up right now. Or you can just completely change the incentive structure altogether and reward the things that you actually want to reward as a positive outcome. It's a lot more easier to incentivize people to do the right thing if the financial outcomes actually match up to what you should be doing, right? And frankly, they don't match up at this moment. If you're a PhD student and you're looking to get a job, you're going to do whatever it takes because you need to eat. You literally need to eat. That when your money is going to run out, you're going to do whatever it takes to get ahead. If you are assistant professor, you're going to do whatever it takes to get ahead. And you're, if you're going to get that tenure, you're going to say, hey, I'm not going to volunteer for this, or I'm not going to do that. Why would I disclose that? I'm not going to answer that email. All of those particular antisocial behaviors. If you're an associate or full professor, you're going to do the same actions because by that time it's sort of programmed into you to focus on trying to be as exploitive as possible. I know this seems like really not nice, but this is literally the culture of science. You talk to almost everybody, implicitly they will say this is what goes on. And there's no amount of volunteering and any of those kind of things. I've tried to do all of those kind of things for a long time, and it just frankly doesn't work. And what you need to do is sort of guard your resources. You have to think about politically, what it is you're doing and sort of figure out how to get ahead. And it's like super sad that you have to do that, but it's really it comes down to, the resources that are around, thinking about financial incentives. And that comes down, that is not the responsibility of the chairs. It's not the responsibility of senior professors. It's really the responsibility of not just the president of a university, but also it is the responsibility of governors and various different sort of lawmakers in the particular place. Governors and, premiers and, all of those people that have in the ability to change the incentive structure at universities. If you want people to actually do the right thing, you have to reward the right behaviors. And so you can't reward outcomes. You need to reward behaviors that will actually get you there and do the right thing. And I know that this is really, this is like, the funny thing is, the irony, right? Like being at a business school, everybody that, we teach this stuff all the time. And it's the real great irony. And yet, you talk to most professors, they're not going to disclose all of these particular actions, right? They're not going to get into all of the details of what they actually do behind the scenes because of that. So if you want to change it, you have to start figuring out how to incentivize team behavior, reward team outcomes, reward group outcomes to some degree, and figure that out, and also reward behaviors and not outcomes themselves. That is the challenge, and I think that's the only way that you're going to change behaviors, or else you're just up, you're going to just be barking up the wind to say that, culture and all of those things are going to change what goes on in academia. That's not what changes it. It's the incentives that actually change it. Like at the end of the day, people they respond quite readily to incentives if those incentives are there. There's no incentive at many places to do things that are for the good of, for the good of science or the good of the greater good, right? Most institutions will reward publishing and research, but the service component, for example, is not really rewarded. That's not going to get you tenure anywhere. It's not going to get you like the next step up anywhere. It's not going to get you hired anywhere. It's like literally meaningless. And I know that this is like really painful for a lot of people to say. It's painful for me to say. It's painful for probably lots of people to sort of listen to this. But ultimately, the only thing that matters is the research outcomes. It's not the research itself, it's the research outcomes. So if you want to change that, you need to start thinking about how you're gonna reward behaviors, how are you gonna sort of focus on incentivizing people to work together, to take the competition out of the game. Competition is good, but to some degree to sort of incentivize things, but then also you need that counteracting incentives to reverse a lot of the bad that happens with competition. And I know I've heard of some institutions changing in Europe the sort of incentive structure of some of these things. So I'm excited to hear that, and I wonder if that's actually going to make the difference. For example, I can't remember what institution. I read an article on it. I think it was just a newspaper article about higher education, and they're not incentivizing publications anymore. They're incentivizing actually putting in the work. And ultimately, if you think about organizations or businesses, you think about the ones that actually function the best and that do a good job, they reward the behavior. They don't reward the outcomes, right? Ultimately, if you reward the outcomes, you're going to create that nasty competitive behavior. And particularly with research and development, sort of areas like this where there's lots of uncertainty, there's just too much involved that's easy to sort of game these things. So that's where I want to leave this. If you want to change, really have better science, you can't just sort of say you got to change the culture. You can't sort of make these sort of small leaps. You need to change the financial incentives and reward behaviors for good behavior, ultimately. And that's ultimately that matters. Look at behaviors and reward those. Like, one thing. So I'm training. We got a puppy, and what you need to do to get good reinforcement. And I sort of studied learning and all that kind of stuff. What you need to do is look at when they actually perform a particular behavior that you like, you reward that. You don't reward the outcome of that particular behavior, right? Of getting to the point of something happening. It's too far down the line before people actually start, before we're animals, right? Before we start sort of recognizing these things. So you need to look at the action, reward that action and behavior instantly, and figure out ways to take out the sort of negative parts of competition. That's all I wanted to say. If you really want to make a difference, ultimately you got to put the money where your mouth is. All right, take care and have a wonderful day.